It's 2023. Do we still need cities? Yeah, let's talk about that.
Instead of focusing on winning arguments, we're teaching the basic fundamentals of sales and marketing and how we can use them to win in the world of politics, teaching you how to meet people where they're at on the issues they care about. Welcome to The Brian Nichols Show.
Well, happy Tuesday. Happy Tuesday there, folks. Brian Nichols here on The Brian Nichols Show. Thank you for joining us on, of course, another fun-filled episode. I am, as always, your humble host, joining you live from our Stratus IP studios here in lovely Eastern Indiana. Don't let cyber attacks or outdated business technology put your company at risk. Yeah, I thought it was Monday because, as you can tell, my brain is still in cybersecurity mode. I've had like 15 million meetings, it seems like, today in the world of cybersecurity and business continuity. So you want to learn more, head to briannicholsshow.com/Stratus IP, and I can show you how we can help you out with your business technology today. But enough of that. Let's go ahead and talk about, yes, the question I teased at the beginning of the episode. It's 2023. Do we, in fact, need cities, or at least the idea of big cities? And I say that as someone who I just moved from Philadelphia, PA, and I got out of there to the Midwest. I escaped to a small-ish little city out in the eastern part of Indiana. And I got to tell you, I'm feeling pretty darn happy. And I see folks who are in the big cities, and they don't seem that they're doing too hot. So to talk about that today, joining us from the Market Urbanism Report, Scott Bayer. Welcome back to the Brian Nichols Show.
Thank you.
Absolutely, my friend. Thank you for returning to the program and obviously talking about all things cities and how we can improve them. But Scott, before we get there, let's go ahead, reintroduce yourself to the Brian Nichols Show audience, and specifically, what's your approach when we're talking about these big, giant areas that we call cities?
Yeah, so I'm Scott Bayer. I own the Market Urbanism Reports, and which is a media company that's dedicated to free market urban policy reform. I'm also somewhat of a journalist, or you might say a urban policy analyst who writes for different publications in the United States. So to answer your question, do we need cities? Just to get right into that. I'm currently on a cross-global trip, which we can get into later on. But I think that, to me, the answer is kind of multifaceted, depending on whether we're talking about the United States or, like, say, the developing world where I am right now. In the U.S., I think you might argue that we don't need cities, although I personally like them, and that's why I write about them. But I'd say with the rise of the automobile and remote work and, satellite internet, and eventually we're supposed to have drone delivery from Amazon and things like that. I would say, like, the world could be, or at least the world in the US, in the advanced world where people have more money to live further apart. It might be that technology is a racing distance, and we don't have a need to centralize anymore, or at least as much. But then I think the angle, when you're talking about the developing world, like what I'm finding, having traveled through Latin America and a lot of Africa now, is that they don't have, because they're not as wealthy of societies, their rural areas are not very modernized. Like, you're often not having running water and basic sanitation and basic, killing off dangerous insects. You don't have that. So people they actually have, for the sake of their livelihoods, to move into cities where the jobs and the social services are. So you're kind of seeing like a reverse migration of what we usually see in the U.S., which is that people are moving from rural areas into cities and suburbs to be able to access stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, because I guess, right, it is through the context of us privileged Americans. Because, do you really need the idea of a big city in order to get the opportunity or the amenities or the basics that we have established as, the basics here in America? And to that point, no. But I guess to the question then I ask for those other areas, right? You're talking about being in South Africa, for example. Is it possible that the tools, the resources that we utilize here in America and in more of the developed world, that those tools that allow us to live in more rural environments, that those could then be brought over to those more impoverished areas. Let's look at the areas like we're talking about with like South Africa, for example, and to help folks be able to have clean drinking water or to have more protective shelter when they're living out in the elements or in the insect infested areas. Is that something that we could see as also a correlation there?
Well, we could, and to some degree, it's already happening. I mean, one thing I'm going to be studying here in Africa as I travel through is the way that first world American farm techniques are being brought to Africa to maximize the use of what is often very fertile land that they just can't maximize because they don't have the technology to do it. And so that would be an example of, yeah, you want to talk about rural modernization and making rural living more attractive and sustainable in Africa, then you bring in first world technology. But I mean, again, it's sort of like we're looking at a gradient here of if the US is an example of one of the most wealthy societies in the world and in world history, there's a gradient where the poorer and poorer the country gets, the more and more cities actually are necessary because it's just, yeah, I mean, remote and I guess you could say decentralized living is kind of a luxury for rich people. You know, like I said, you do need an automobile, and so in the U.S. we're rich and we can afford to live that lifestyle.
So let's talk about the future then of what you're experiencing and trying to uncover as you're going across the south part of the globe, and that's quite literally the southern hemisphere that you're going through. So talk to us about this trip that you're on, what you're looking to accomplish as you're going through there.
Yeah, so I'm on a 1.5-year trip of the global south, and that began in July of 2022. My first 5 months were Latin America. I went to 12 countries in Latin America. And then 2023, half of it will be in Africa. So I'm in South Africa now, and I'm going to be moving my way north. And then the final 6 months of 2023 will be Asia. So starting in Dubai, ending in Tokyo, and then flying back to Virginia and restarting my life in the US.
So what inspired that entire trip?
Well, I'd say it's probably three things. The main one is just that I like to travel, and this seemed like a good time in my life to be able to do it. I'd say secondary would be journalism. Wanting to expand on the coverage that Market Urbanism report, which is mostly focused on U.S. cities and its young history, maybe expanding to some global issues, more urban issues. And then I think thirdly would just be from an investing standpoint. You can probably see the writing on the wall the same as I, where certain economic fundamentals of the U.S. are not so great in respect to debt and inflation. And so I think it's good to have a diversified portfolio that includes potentially emerging markets. And so this little tour through the global south is like looking for specific, let's say, genres and companies that might be worth me investing in to diversify my portfolio.
Yeah, a good buddy of the show here, Mikkel Thorup. He is the host of the Expat Money Show, and he's all about how do you get out of the United States, become an expatriate, how do you focus on to invest in the alternatives that are out there versus what we've grown up to think is the only solution, and that is here in America. So with that being said, I mean, obviously this is definitely, I think, where a lot of folks' heads are at. Also, we're seeing inside the United States the conversation of a national divorce, and I hear other folks talking about the idea of a civil war. I don't want that. Nobody wants that. But let's talk about maybe the idea, though, of a national divorce, because I think we're hearing actually folks on both sides of the political aisle talking about this. Do you see the idea of a national divorce impacting market urbanism as things move forward?
Well, that kind of overlaps with where my head is going on some of the urban stuff. I've increasingly come to believe that the rise of city-states, like, when you think of Dubai and Singapore, those have been very successful examples. And it shows that bigger isn't necessarily better when it comes to government. I mean, a lot of the most effective jurisdictions in the world are these little like 50 square mile city-states where they just have huge amounts of economic freedom, basically, and they have autonomy just to run the way they want to. And I'd really like to see that experiment in the U.S. I mean, I'm not necessarily opposed to the U.S. being broken up in some respects, and like, let's have some experimentation about what kind of political systems we can pursue in the U.S. So that seems like a more practical way to have more experimentation, as opposed to like a scorched earth. Texas succeeds completely, and everybody hates each other, and that kind of thing. It seems like it would lead to less bloodshed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure, and that's what we're looking to accomplish, right? Is as much peace as a possible outcome. I think that's across the board. But let's go towards this idea of market urbanism. I think it's important for some of the folks who maybe are returning to the show, or rather, they're joining us for the first time as you return to the show, and they're not familiar with this idea of market urbanism. They've heard us talk about it a few times, and they're like, what is this term? So in layman's terms, do us a favor, Scott. Explain what is market urbanism and how does it impact the way that cities function?
So bumper sticker version, the mix between free market policy and urban issues. A more elaborated version would be, it's the use of classical liberal ideas in economics applied specifically to city issues. So how did the teachings of Adam Smith, Frederick Hayek, and some other thinkers apply to things like housing, transportation, city administration? There's two specific versions of market urbanism that I focus on in Market Urbanism Report. And the first one is kind of like, how can this theory be used? How can this policy be used in a pragmatic way in existing cities like New York and Philadelphia? Like, what's a moderate version of this, of like, say, libertarian ideas that can pass politically in places that are otherwise like democratic voting and leftist? But I think the other version of market urbanism that's more of the theory is just asking, like, at a philosophical level, so how would cities work if they were completely private? And rather than having like raw democracy and some of the things we lionize about politics in this country, what if a board of investors, say, ran a city? And what if they operated like startups? So that's more of a theoretical interpretation of market urbanism, because it's not used very often around the world. But I am actually studying some of these examples as I travel.
Do you have some examples off the top of your head of market urbanism in practice that we could think of as some modern day examples?
Well, yeah, I mean, so the types of places, like, a lot of this tour is designed to see quote unquote startup cities around the world. And so what that is basically private developers will assemble greenfield land. It is happening a lot more in the developing world than in, say, the US and Europe. But they assemble greenfield lands. They write a contract with the surrounding jurisdiction, basically saying, we want autonomy to build the city the way we want. And it is, in fact, built on private sector principles. Like, it's for profit. It's run by a CEO rather than an elected mayor and manager. And so it is very much of a private sector outcome. I think, like, if you want an example of one type of city that I've gone to see, it's there's one called Prospera in Honduras, and I think your followers would be really interested in that, because it's been branded to some degree or another as kind of like a libertarian experiment taking place in a third world country, and it's going to have like English common law and all of these policy, I don't know if you want to say innovations, but policy best practices being used in a very small, like 1 square mile context.
Well, Scott, I'm glad you brought that up, because you may have read my mind, because believe it or not, we actually did an entire episode on Prospera with Joel Baumgar on the show. This was episode 428 back in January of last year. So yes, prime example. I'm actually going to include this in the show notes, and I'll include this episode as well for you YouTube watcher as well. When you just watch the end of the episode, a video will pop up. Make sure you check this episode out, because it is awesome. So yeah, no, 100% is a great example. And I was wondering if you're going to bring this up as an example, because Joel did an amazing job explaining how basically this thought experiment that we have talked about in our little group chats and stuff, right, is becoming reality. And it's showing not just how it can work, but now it's becoming a case study that we can start to look to as an example when we're trying to start this stuff in other places. And also to the part that I think it goes beyond what we're talking about when we're talking about the political and the principles and the philosophical stuff. But what's the actual impact that for example, Prospera brought to the people of Prospera? And that is, it brought opportunity. It brought a different way of doing things for the people living there. So it actually helped improve opportunities for folks where now all of a sudden they had jobs that weren't available before. So yes, you are seeing that it does impact folks across the board. So I'm glad you brought that up, Joel or Scott. Thank you.
Yeah, and I visited Prospera last summer during my Honduras stop, and I saw a lot of promise in it. I mean, it's very early on, but I think in some cases it's further along than what people might expect. I mean, it's actually developing residents in the community now, and it's on some beautiful island property that looks out over the ocean. And I found that they were employing a lot of locals. So that's one of the promises that of I think Prospera. It's not just going to be like this city that's necessarily attracting say the global entrepreneurial elites, although it will be doing some of that. But I think a lot of the promise of these private cities is that they're going to have spillover effects on the local population of more jobs, more prosperity, higher property values, things like that.
Yep. And I'm sorry, YouTube viewer, I just realized this video was recorded right when I was moving from Philadelphia to Indiana. So there actually was no YouTube episode. So this is going to be an audio only exclusive for folks who want to check that out. But don't worry, it's going to be in the show notes. So folks can go ahead and check out that episode with Joel. But otherwise, with that being said, Scott, we are getting towards the tail end of the episode. So when we're talking about market urbanism, right? And I think it is a topic that a lot of folks, they're trying to pick up, right? They're trying to, maybe they don't know the term itself, but they understand what you're looking to accomplish. And they're trying to implement some of this market urbanism into their communities. What would be the best way you would recommend for someone to be able to start making a change in their immediate circles to make things in a more pro-market urbanist approach?
Yeah, and that gets back to the first definition of market urbanism, because not everyone can build their own city, their own libertarian experiment. So how do you, if you're the average Joe and you're just living in a existing city, you can go to What is Market Urbanism. We have a page on my site that just goes over the different issues. But I mean, I think if you're dealing, say, with high home costs in your city, you can look at the market urbanist literature on why that is. It usually has to do with government regulations and sort of like this entrenched regulatory paradigm, particularly around zoning, but other things as well. And you can go to your meetings and bring public meetings and bring that up, because a lot of times people are defending these regulations, but there's not many people at these public meetings that are saying, no, these are actually the reason we have a housing shortage. This is the reason that housing in the city is 30% above the national median, so on and so forth.
It's amazing. Just get involved, people. How about that? And by the way, that speaks to by my sponsor, which is me. How about that, folks? We have a brand new free ebook, and that is How to Win Your Local Election. Speaks to the importance of also getting involved locally, right, Scott? So go ahead, grab your free ebook. We're going to show you everything you need to know from number one, launching a campaign. What does that entail? Fundraising, voter outreach, messaging, all that in between. Head to briannicholsshow.com/win local. Get your free copy today. And with that, Scott, we are unfortunately at the point of the episode where we are getting ready for our final thoughts, and I will kick things off. How about that? I think it's important for folks to get involved, not just in their communities, but also for us to start changing the conversation. How do we do that? And I think this is where I've tried to make a difference here in the Greater Liberty Movement, is teaching folks how to enter into these conversations that traditionally are a little uncomfortable, right? Or they would traditionally put up defenses. People, when they hear politics start as the conversation point, they instantly know what their opinion is, and they're putting the barriers up. They're putting the defenses up. So we want to be able to break down those defenses. And I think if you live in a big city and you see the problems, right? I lived in Philadelphia. I saw the issues when COVID hit and the garbage didn't show up for literally 4 weeks. It was gross. I mean, rats running on the garbage. Talk about a health hazard. It was more of a health hazard than COVID was, for sure. And yet that happened, right? That happened in my backyard. So being able to get involved, talk to those community leaders, make change, and show up. Get to in actually standing in the events where the rooms where it's happening, where folks are standing there and having these conversations that are impacting the way you live your life. So that's my final thoughts. Scott, what do you have for us all the way down in South Africa today?
Well, they don't call it Philadelphia for no reason.
I get the truth.
Those aren't my final thoughts. Yeah, my final thoughts are, I'd say follow my journey and look it up in the show notes, because it is going to be an interesting thing. The cities of the developing world are very, very different than the U.S. The challenges, which we kind of already went over, are very. It's like another world, and it does make you very appreciative for the United States and the type of standard of living that we get to enjoy. In my mind, largely because we did follow a capitalistic system, and I hope that we continue to, so that people aren't having to diversify their portfolios away from the U.S. And I hope we remember what political principles got us to where we are today.
Amen. Well, Scott, with that being said, it's on to the audience now to actually take initiative, to move things forward. So, folks, if you are willing to take the challenge, should you choose to, that is, well, please do me a favor. Start things off by sharing today's episode. And when you do, please tag yours truly at B Nichols Liberty. Scott, where can folks go ahead and find you? They want to continue the conversation.
MarketUrbanismReport.com. And if you want a day-to-day look at my photo essays from Stop to Stop, the Market Urbanism Report Facebook group.
A+, I'm a member and I enjoy it thoroughly. So, folks, if you, again, got some value, please go ahead and share today's episode. Also, go ahead and give us a 5-star rating and review if you would be so kind. And, oh, by the way, we have an amazing shop of all types of goodies you can get to be, yes, the most amazing Liberty lover out there. You can rock your Brian Nichols Show swag, but also change some hearts and minds and get some laughs along the way. We have our, now that's what I call tyranny, Klaus Schwab shirt, Magic Money Tree shirt. Yeah, we have that as well. Plus, what happened in 1971? We're asking good questions. And speaking of asking good questions, have you gotten our question everything? Or, yeah, our good ideas don't require forced bumper stickers that are over at the shop. Well, either way, do me a favor. Use code TBNS at checkout. Do yourself a favor. Yeah, save 10% off your order. And by the way, it's a libertarian organization, too, that you're supporting. So it's a win-win. You get some awesome stuff, and you're supporting fellow libertarians along the way. So with that being said, folks, that's all we have for you today. I think, with that, looking at where we are, Scott, I'm excited to see the future of market urbanism. So thank you for all you're doing. And folks, if you got some value from what Scott's doing, go ahead, reach out. Tell him you heard him on the Brian Nichols Show and you appreciate all he's doing. But with that being said, thank you for joining us on, of course, another fun-filled episode. With that being said, Brian Nichols signing off here on the Brian Nichols Show for Scott Bayer. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for listening to the Brian Nichols Show. Find more episodes at briannicholsshow.com.